Can you hear me? Yes. Yes, okay. All of that stuff, basically, for those of you who are senior professors, you know the secret of having some kinds of success, and that is to have lots of colleagues and especially graduate students to steal ideas from. If you're a graduate student, the answer is, and I think this is true for Bill and me and my colleagues here, Andy Beatty and Chris Turnbull, my wife, and so on. If you want to have some kind of successful career, pick something you love. In other words, all the people that I know that do all these kinds of things do it not because they're working, but because they just love it. Now, it's great to be back in Cairns. I didn't think I met any of you when the first time I was here, which was in 1965. I'm a light plane pilot. I had a friend who studied parrots named John Legay Brereton, who had been a fighter pilot in the RAAF during the very late nastiness, about around 1945. And so we flew Charles Birch up here. How many of you know who Charles Birch was? Everybody here should know that arguably the best ecologist of all time, but certainly one of the top 3 or 4, was an Aussie. And it's typical of Australia, particularly in those days, and by the way, I'm a part-time Aussie, as you may know, a Sydney-sider, is that the focus has always been on disasters from England. When I first came over here, the only chefs in Sydney were ones who couldn't make the grade in England. Now, and I live a lot of the time in Sydney, if I had to eat in one city in the world, it would be in Sydney. Australia has the best per capita group of ecologists in the world, without question. And yet many of your state governments still censor what they say. Australians don't appreciate the quality of the ecological community here, and it's really disgusting. But when you want to start talking about disgusting, yesterday really takes the prize. I said I'm a part-time Sydney-sider, but I'm really considering becoming a full-time, or maybe. There are lots, by the way, it was not a big surprise to Anne or me because we'd been in England just before the Brexit thing, and cab drivers were telling us about how much. In other words, we ran into all over the place non-elite views of what was going to happen. Now, obviously, I don't want to say anything political here, but our presidential campaign did not have a single debate in the primaries or in the main election over any issue that's important. The entire thing. For example, if you think about environmental issues, one of the sad things is most people think the main environmental problem is climate disruption. Climate disruption is certainly a huge problem. It may be the worst, but then again, toxification of the planet may be worse than that. What I'm going to try and do for the next hour and a half, 3 hours, Bill said I could go on to 5 hours, but I don't like to talk that long. I've got a bad voice, is talk about one of the central problems, and that is the extinction problem, one that is utterly unrecognized by the media in the United States, unrecognized by our university system. By the way, our universities were designed by a colleague of mine, probably none of you met because you're young, but the way they're structured, the reason you can't learn anything about the real world normally in a university without searching for it is their structure. And it was developed by a guy. Anybody meet Aristotle here? Aristotle is the one who did it. It was bar mitzvahed finally by the Royal Society about 1590. And that's why you can get all the way through Stanford University if you don't pay attention, not knowing how the climate works, not knowing what the second law of thermodynamics tells you can and can't do, not knowing what an ecosystem service is, not even knowing what an externality is, although most of the students do take economics, but they take economics from idiots, so it doesn't do much good. And the extinction crisis is one that doesn't call itself to people's attention, just like until very recently, climate disruption didn't call things to people's attention. And the reason is that although we're in the beginning of the 6th great extinction, people don't see things disappearing. First of all, most people stay in cities. Now, roughly half of the people in the world, and Australia, of course, a prime example of this. Almost everybody in Australia lives in a city, and you guys are living in a more and more giant city. I mean, when I came up here the first time, we stayed in a tiny little motel and ate in a tiny little terrible restaurant. I don't even remember what it was. I've been here maybe 7 or 8 times since. The last time before this, I went into a shopping mall that had 3 different sushi joints in it. I mean, that's some small change from the last time. You can tell my voice is already fading and it needs gin to irrigate it. But the problem is that we've done recent studies to trying to figure out how much are we actually entering a 6th grade extinction. Remember, the history of life, hopefully you all know, has been very uneven. The first great extinction event was at the end of the Ordovician period, about 450 million years ago, if I recall correctly. The next one was the end of the Devonian, I think. Let's see. Ordovician, Devonian, that was about 375. Then there was the Permian about 250, and the end of the Triassic about 100 million years ago. And then the last is when the dinosaurs bit the dust, along with a lot of other things, 65 or 66 million years ago. Isn't it a coincidence that all these extinction events happened at the end of a period that the geologists had designated? And you never think about that? Who doesn't know why most people are laughing? Anyway, all right. So are we in a 6th grade extinction extent? Well, actually, a lot of the credit for this goes to paleontologists, particularly Tony Barnofsky and some of his colleagues who've looked very, very carefully at the extinction record in the fossil record and have done a very careful estimates of what the rate of extinction was outside of really big extinction events. And they've came up with a very conservative estimate of what the normal extinction rate was, and that asked the question, are we in a period of normal extinction rate or extremely rapid extinction rate? And to conservatively look at that, they took a very conservative estimate, a low estimate of the number of extinctions, primarily in the mammal fauna, in the last, since 1500. And it turns out, depending on what group of organisms you look at and exactly how you do it, the rate of extinction today is something like 10 to 100 times as rapid as it was in the normal background rate that went on in between all those extinction events that I mentioned. And that turns out that means the extinctions we've had since 1500 normally would have taken, this is really order of magnitude, several thousand years to take place at the rate of if it were the background, just the background extinction rate. So that's one bit of evidence that we're in a mass extinction event now. And there's lots and lots of evidence like that. Much more powerful in many ways, however, is looking at what's happening to populations. Why would one want to look at populations? First of all, when things go extinct, the first thing that happens is some of their populations go away. Most organisms have more than one population. They're spread in various habitats, and you know this from your own experience. No species goes extinct till all of its populations are gone. That's what happens. By the time something is listed as endangered, the critical roles that it plays in ecosystems, the critical roles that it plays in supporting our lives are basically gone ordinarily. You know, you only have one population left. The ecosystem functions that they have just are not going around. We did a recent study in which we looked at 27,000 species of vertebrates, and at least a third of them have lost populations in the historic record, and that's an enormous number because very few have been studied. It's amazing how little we know about the sequence of population sizes in organisms. Everybody, when they talk to me, they seem to say, well, gee, you know, we must know how many cassowaries there were 500 years ago, how many there were 100 years ago, how many there were 20 years. Of course, the censusing organisms is really tricky. Censusing them in tropical rainforests, which is, of course, one of the centers of extinction. You want to know what the role of the tropics are in extinction? Well, humanity's vast array, its incredible library of genetic diversity, is primarily in the tropics. And if any of you tried to census anything in a tropical forest, you know it ain't easy. It's tough enough if you can see the organism. I mean, the work I did was collecting butterflies in fields without bushes. And so you could get out there, you could catch the butterflies, you could write a number on it, you could let it go. You could come back the next day, catch a bunch of butterflies, see how many were marked, and get a population estimate. Can't do that with rainforest trees or birds in rainforests, unless you're Jared Diamond. How many of you know Jared? You know about Jared? The incredible thing about Jared is I went into a New Guinea forest with him once, and he named 35 birds by listening to them before I saw one. And the 35th bird he had called correctly before I saw it. That's incredible. He's got, there's that special talent, perfect pitch. He's a good musician, but he has in his mind the songs of every damn bird in New Guinea. It's really embarrassing to go out. That's why I stick with butterflies. Their songs are all uniform. If you look at mammals in general, we had 173 mammals for which we had really excellent data, and all of them had lost more than half of their populations. And in Southeast Asia, the mammals that they've been able to track have all lost more than 80% of their populations. Got to remember, for instance, that the lion, which is sort of thought of as a common organism, used to have a range from India all the way through Middle East and down into Africa, and all of Africa. And I would guess right off the top of my head that about 90% of those populations at least are gone if you look at a map of their distribution now. And it's much worse than that because, of course, when you say the populations are gone, this doesn't tell you anything about the shrinkage of the other populations. It's just basically dealing with range maps. So when you think of the extinction crisis itself, yeah, last year, undoubtedly, 2 species of mammals that we know about went extinct. That's usually about the number, but one will be a single population of obscure bat on an island in the Pacific, and the other will be in the center of the Amazon, or the loss, for instance, of the, I can't remember the name of the key in the island, the Bramble Key, all right. So, but how many people sitting on Wall Street or down in Canberra making trouble have any idea what Bramble Key is like, what the Great Barrier Reef is like? I mean, one of the sad things about Australia is how many people have never been out of one of the cities. But I have to say, from studying birds in Sydney, there are interesting organisms even in the cities in Australia. And one organism that isn't here, which I've run into in New Guinea, is called Plasmodium. Any of you run into Plasmodium? Particularly one species of Plasmodium. Anyway, that's malaria, for those of you who don't know. Anyway, the data indicate that we're losing populations at an incredible rate, probably billions of times faster than we're losing distinct things. And by the way, there is no definition of species. Species are just different kinds of organisms, and there's no point at all. I've been told many times, how can you possibly know that we have an extinction crisis when we haven't counted and named all the species? It's like standing there while the beach disappears and say, how can we tell the beach is eroding? We haven't named all the sand grains and counted them, and so on. First of all, as all you know from high school, every organism has to have a suitable habitat. And guess what? Most of them didn't evolve to live in cut-over farm fields with lousy soil, under pavement in cities, et cetera, et cetera. The mere destruction of habitats that we all see all the time tells us there's an extinction crisis. You don't have to do one damn number, just drive around somewhere. And you'll, I was interesting, a little article just the other day, a guy pointing out that in England when he was a kid, when they drove down to the shore, they drove through blizzards of moths. There ain't no blizzards of moths anymore. When I was a kid, I used to go out to collect the pupae of the big silkworm moths that occur in the eastern United States. Basically, they're gone. Nobody ever sees them anymore. Why are they gone? Well, one idea was that it was the ultraviolet coming from street lights that attracted them, but it looks more likely that it was a fly that was brought in from Europe to control an insect pest. But with all the things we're doing, one does not really have to wonder whether we have an extinction crisis. And when you think about what the situation is, we also have a zombie flora and fauna that people don't recognize. That is, there's lots of things that haven't been counted as extinct, but when you know what's happened and what's happening, you know they're doomed already. They're the walking dead. One estimate has that there's an extinction debt in the Amazon. That means that there's about 10 years of returning carbon to the atmosphere, contributing to global climate change, about a 10-year backlog, because there are all these things that are actually going to go extinct and die, and then their carbon is going to be returned to the atmosphere. So there's no real question that we're in the middle of an extinction crisis. There's lots of question about what we're going to do about it. And there's, of course, huge concern. I suspect half at least, or maybe all of you, are involved in some kind of conservation effort somewhere. One of the things that I've been privileged to do is visit some of the sites in Australia where efforts are being made to preserve extraordinarily interesting organisms. Anne and Chris and Andy and I sat for, about 2 hours in front of a termite mound to see a golden-shouldered parrot come in and leave. And absolutely incredible organism, and there's incredible people out there in Queensland trying very hard to reverse the changes in the fire regime, in the presence of other birds and so on and so forth that are endangering the golden-shouldered parrot. In the very southwestern corner of Tasmania, if any of you ever have a chance to get down there, for us pilots, it's an incredible thing to fly along the southern coast of Tasmania. And in the very southwest corner, Anne and I were privileged to see probably 50%, 30 or 40 individuals of a wild population of the orange-bellied parrot, one of the 2 parrots in Australia that migrate. But unfortunately, where they end up at the other end of the migration, there's all kinds of problems, which is along the southern coast of the mainland. And the changed fire regime and other things in Tasmania are threatening it, but huge efforts are being put in by Aussies to preserve this incredibly beautiful bird. So there's a lot of individual action. And all of you have doubtless heard about the efforts to save the elephants, to save the rhinos. Why are the elephants and rhinos down to probably less than the elephants are estimated to be down to less than 0.1% of their original population size, and they're going very, very fast. That's over ivory. The rhinos, of course, are going because of idiotic ideas of Chinese medicine and daggers for Middle Easterners. The horns are so incredibly valuable. We thought for a while that Viagra was going to save the rhinos because, of course, Viagra works, and if you're having sexual problems, save your nail clippings and you'll have the equivalent of rhino horn at a much lower price. I don't guarantee, but Viagra is reputed to actually work. And then we were told by a graduate student about a year ago that had been working over there that the traders are now grinding Viagra in with the horn. If that isn't the most disgusting story virtually you've ever heard, it's just unbelievable. So we're doing a lot of efforts, but a lot of the effort isn't having much impact. We have lots and lots of national parks in Australia. At least when I last looked, almost every one was on soil lousy enough that the farmers and the grazers didn't want it. In other words, there was a huge debate in the literature about the design of nature reserves. I personally know the only person, a woman named Claire Kremen, who ever designed a nature reserve. Big argument whether you should have one big reserve or many smaller reserves. Nobody's designing nature reserves. Obviously, Ed Wilson just wrote a book and said we ought to put aside half the world for biodiversity, which would be a very good idea for human survival because, of course, as hopefully you all know, we are living on our capital and heading for a collapse. Whether it'll come, I was a little surprised that the political collapse seems to be coming before the financial one, but they may be tied together. But of course, the climate situation and so on, all undebated, very grim, all tied together with the biodiversity crisis. I mean, for example, one of the really critical things that biodiversity does is what Andy Beattie has called production biodiversity. That is, the things that are so intimately tied to our agricultural system that's a main place where biodiversity is supporting human beings. We have 7.4 some billion people on the planet now. The projections are to add roughly 2.5 billion more people than were alive when I was born in 1932 by 2050. They're going to have to be fed. They're going to have to be fed despite climate disruption. One of the really silly things is everybody's scared witless about sea level rise. Well, we were just out at, was it Honky's Knob? It's Yorkie's Knob, I can't remember. I didn't know Yorkie personally anyway. But if you go out there, it's clear they're not going to be there in 100 years, maybe much less than that. But I guarantee you right here, for example, sea level rise, if it occurs, you'll be able to walk away from it no matter what the speed is. Sea level rise is going to cause problems for hundreds of millions or even billions of people. It's going to be slow process. But of course, climate disruption is going to screw up the food system and get you right away. And nobody is paying attention to that at all. For instance, we would not be in high yield agriculture if it were not for the natural controls of pests of crops. We cannot control them, as we have learned, with pesticides. First of all, the pesticides gradually destroy the soil, which means the fertility goes and the crops won't grow and the crops get disease and so on. So we're in a constant race to try and find new pesticides that will work, but the organisms evolve resistance to them much more rapidly. Same thing with artificial fertilization. Industrial agriculture is a gigantic disaster. Huge mistake. We never should have gone there. The most recent work shows that much more ecologically sound forms of agriculture can be just as productive, but it can't make as much money for big corporations, and that seems to make a difference. So we have a disastrous agricultural system desperately in need of crop protection, biodiversity, desperately in need of pollination. Yes, the main feeding base of humanity is grasses, and they're wind pollinated. But if you want to have a nutritious diet, you need things that are animal pollinated. And we're losing the pollinators, in part because of the kind of pesticides we're using. Nobody seems to register on that. Climate change is already affecting the production rates of the most important crops like wheat and rice. And yet, about a third of the greenhouse gases come from the food system. So you're expecting more people when you already have roughly 800 million people hungry today and another 2 billion micronutrient malnourished because they have lousy diets and can't function well. And we're going to add 2.5 billion people by 2050. It's going to be quite a race, particularly if you're trying to work with industrial agriculture, which is an ecological disaster, but it's an embedded ecological disaster. And of course, Australia is in one way ahead of the United States in this general area. And that is, while you have discussions about immigration, you also have discussions about population size. You have the idiot big Australia bunch, and then you have a bunch of people who realize Australia is already vastly overpopulated for the long term and is going to have to change its way. In the United States, we have debates over immigration, but the issue of how many people are to live in the United States has never been raised by a major politician, ever. And it's insane to see these long discussions. I mean, after all, one thing that was discussed, not in any sensible way, not by anybody who knew anything about it, my immigration situation was discussed in the debates. Are you going to build a wall or are you not going to build a wall? An absolute, a thing so far out from what you should be discussing in terms just of the immigration, not population size, that it is mind-boggling. But nobody ever said, how many people do we want to have in the country? We have over 300 million now, wildly overpopulated. Everybody says, well, we're all doing great. Well, we're all doing great except those who aren't eating well, A, and B, of course, we're using the resources of the world. We're not living on the United States, we're living on the world's resources. Curiously enough, when we live on the world's resources and the flow of goods and materials coming into the United States is gigantic, guess what? People follow it, you know? But there's never been, since in 1970, roughly, there was a small debate. One president had a commission on population size, but it's just totally disappeared. We are going, like any good economist knows, grow forever. You all know that on a finite planet, you can have an infinite number of people. As a distinguished specialist in mail order marketing once said, the population we have enough knowledge in our brains and computers to keep the population growing for 7 billion years. Now, it turns out if you can do arithmetic, after about 3,000 or 4,000, as I recall, there are more people than elementary particles in the universe. But John Holdren, Obama's science advisor, said, I thought it was just 6 billion years. I couldn't get it straight. No, I mean, we have an economic system. By the way, there's some superb economists who know better. In other words, not all economists are idiots. But the basic idea in the Wall Street Journal, have you seen any problem that wasn't going to be solved by more economic growth, right? We're going to go 3% a year. Just do the arithmetic. It's one of the problems with our educational system is that people never learn to do arithmetic. They think you can go forever at 3% a year, don't know what that implies. And yet, every politician feels perfectly all right, and this includes Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, whatever that other guy's name is, and so on, fully believe that the ideal thing is to keep your economy growing at 3% a year. They miss some of the little curious statistics that leads us to believe that's not going to happen. For example, hopefully you all know EROI or EROEI, energy return on energy invested. When you got a gusher in a Texas oil field in 1910, you had to put something like, you got back about 100 times as much energy as you put into the drilling and building the derrick and all that sort of thing. Now in the Canadian tar sands, you get back about 4 units for every one you put in. We're going from 100 to 1 to 4 to 1. And of course, that doesn't count the externalities in any way, the horrendous destruction caused by this. In other words, we're smart as human beings, social animal, used to living in groups of 150, now trying to live in groups of billions and failing at it. But if you look at it, of course, we pick the low-hanging fruit first. It gets worse and worse and worse. Every person you add to the population requires disproportionately more resources and support and biodiversity than the one before. Because, of course, we're dealing with a finite system. We're living on our capital. And the glorious thing is we keep bragging about how the checks we're able to write at the end of every year. We write checks and we're spending, spending, spending. Where do you hear about the balance? You got to go someplace like the web to the footprint network or something to see what's actually happening in the world. A few economists have turned around and looking at this. For instance, when they looked at the natural resources being exhausted in Indonesia, it turned out that their growth rate, which they thought was 3 or 4% a year, was negative. In other words, we're doing something that no sane family would do, and that is burning their savings without thinking about how long they're going to last or what the consequences are going to be. So we're in a cheery situation. And the issue is, what are we going to do about it? Well, the problem is virtually every scientist who's looked at this knows what we have to do about it if we want to avoid a total collapse. And many of them believe, as I do, there's no way of avoiding a total collapse because of the way the political system works. The scale of the human enterprise is already much too large. If you kept the distribution of wealth roughly the way it is today, then it would require somewhat more than 1.5 Earths to be sustainable at the rate we're using stuff. If you moved it up to the standard of Australia or the United States, you'd need 5 more Earths, roughly. Again, it depends on exactly how you do the statistics and so on. We're way in overshoot already. So what sorts of things we ought to be doing? Well, one, of course, very basic, is the number of people. If you want to do something about the number of people and you want to do it humanely, it's a big, long-term job. What's the first thing you should do? As Donald Trump, I'm sure, would tell you, give absolutely equal rights to every woman, equal opportunities to women everywhere. Because if there's one thing that's empirically very well known, is when you give rights and opportunities and jobs and equal pay and equal respect and so on to women, total fertility rates go down like that. So start. Going to take a very long time. If we started yesterday, it's going to be way, way, way into the next century before we're even on a decline, let alone a decline to a sustainable number. What's a sustainable number? Nobody knows, because it depends on what assumptions you make about technologies on one side and living styles on the other. In other words, where do you want to stop? You can obviously have more people living in what Gretchen Daly calls as a battery chicken situation, where everybody has absolute minimum food, space, and so on. Or if you want to have a life like most Aussies and most Americans would like to have, the best estimates, the only ones I really have great confidence in, because Ann and I and Gretchen did them, are about 1.5 to 2 billion people you might support long-term on the planet. You want to maximize the number of people. There's absolutely no question. You don't keep the population growing now till the whole mess collapses. You have a few billion people at most for millions of years, and you could theoretically do it if you could get yourself organized to do it. But that's a rather big question. Can you get yourself organized to do it? But that would be the first place to start. The second place would be to see to it that every human being who is sexually active and heterosexual had access to modern contraception and backup abortion. Minimal thing. Anybody who opposes that, extremely unethical. They can't imagine anything more unethical than trying to prevent people to control their own bodies. Some people disagree with me on that. They're wrong. So that would be a good. By the way, I personally think, and I think most all my colleagues agree, that for the new generation, for people coming along now, stop at 1 is the answer. In other words, you're not going to get the population decline that we need before the collapse overtakes us if people average out at about 2. But that should be a topic of debate, and it should be a topic that demographers give people numbers on and that geologists give people numbers on. One of the nice things, everybody says, oh, the Chinese are just terrible. Ghastly. They said you could only have 1 kid and there were penalties if you had more. Well, first of all, Ann and I went to China, I don't know, was it about 1990, roughly, and had a meeting. Ann, by the way, was co-author on the population bomb, but I was a naive, idiot young man at the time, and the publisher said, we only want 1 name on it because single-authored books sell better than double-authored books. And I've been ashamed of that ever since. And she's beaten up on me continuously since for over 60 years. I mean, can you imagine? But we had a special meeting arranged with about 35 leading Chinese women. And the reason we wanted to discuss with them, which I've done since in China, also is to discuss their attitude towards the one-child policy, which was put together, by the way, by a guy who's a close colleague of one of my ex-postdocs, who's now a faculty member at Stanford. It was not done by a demographer, it was done by an engineer. But anyway, in the first 5 minutes, they all said the same thing. We did a resource analysis. We realized that our population statistics had been off, and we had to do something, and we did the right thing, and there was not a word, not a peep. And this is a private, secret meeting. And then one of the women said, but I'm the best neurosurgeon in China, but I will never be head of my service because I'm a woman. And the rest of an hour plus was stories of how the vaunted Chinese, equal gender stuff was just bullshit. And that in fact, all of them had stories of how, same thing by the way, we have a lot of friends in Sweden, run into exactly the same thing. Everybody thinks that women's situation in Sweden is ideal and just like men's. Hogwash. Just ask a Swedish woman sometime. Ask a Swedish woman in policy or politics or medicine or something like that. So one of the things, if you have an interest in doing something good in the world, is to fight really hard to get equity for females around the planet. That would be a great start. But again, it takes a long time to have that turn out even if you get a one-child family. There's a huge momentum in population growth. We're already wildly overpopulated, and we're doomed to more growth, even with large numbers of deaths. If the death rate goes up substantially, a paper by one of the top ecologists in Australia, Corey Bradshaw, and his colleague Brooks. What's Brooks' first name? Barry Brooks, right, sorry. Senior moment. Showing that it's almost impossible, even with huge numbers of deaths, to have a smaller population in 2100 than we have today. Now, the cheery side of it, of course, is the destruction that we're creating on the planet is a combination of two things, basically. How many people you have and how much each one consumes. And the issue of consumption can be fixed a lot faster than the issue of population, like instantaneously, very nearly. Now, most of you are too young, but on December 7th, 1941, there was a start of a little disagreement between Japan and the United States. And on December 8th, by December 7th, 1941, we had produced almost 4 million automobiles in the United States. December 8th, that all came to an end, basically, and we started producing tanks and airplanes and howitzers and tons and tons and tons, billions of tons of ammunition and so on. Meat was rationed, gasoline was rationed. I remember that for beef, you had red points in a book, and I was old enough to remember all this stuff. And I remember my grandparents coming to have dinner with us on a Sunday. I started a couple days after I was born in '32. My father lost his job in the Depression. We were always aware of the financial situation. We got another job, but the financial situation was always near the front. And we always knew we were okay if we had a raw roast beef, nearly raw, for Sunday night dinner. My father trained me to like beef barely cooked. And so my grandparents are coming up for Sunday night dinner around 1944, and my mother produces this giant standing rib roast. And my grandfather says, wow, that must have cost you a lot of red points. And my father said, nah, we got it at Whirlaway. What's Whirlaway? When beef became rationed, a whole string of horse meat stores opened up, named after the last winner of the Kentucky Derby. I mean, anybody in Australia can understand this for the Melbourne Cup. It, of course, was beef, but my grandparents wouldn't touch it. And my mother was swearing on the Bible that it's really beef, but I got to eat most of it anyway. You can really change things fast on the consumption side if you have the willingness of the population to go along with it. And of course, there was all kinds of Mickey Mouse connected with it, but nonetheless, that went over. And then in 1945, by 1946, they were back to producing automobiles in large numbers, TV sets. I mean, I saw TV. My first girlfriend was a daughter of a a guy who worked at Philco. It was called Atwater Kent at the time. And they had a TV set. And it was a little bigger than this. And the screen was like that. I actually watching a football game was like watching ants. So small ants. It was interesting, actually, you know. I don't want to be entirely negative about what we've done. That girlfriend in 1939 or 40, what did she have? A choice of opportunity. She could be a nurse, she could be a secretary, or she could be a teacher in a lower grade. That was damn near it. And yet, when I took my instrument training, I trained with a female pilot. And I expect most of you have been on an airliner that's had a female captain. When I was a kid, you could burn somebody with a dark skin alive without any problem. In the United States, lynchings were abundant. You could send a picture of the body through the US mail on a postcard. There were the only people who appeared in entertainment who were African American were occasional janitors in movies. The only sport in which they were welcome was prize fighting, and when Joe Louis was black champion, the New York Times could write that we need a white hope, and that was in the 30s and 40s. During the Second World War, German prisoners in Alabama were fed in restaurants that would not serve American servicemen. I mean, things have changed. So we've gone, and one of the things that gives me hope about what we might do about the vast array of problems that I could go on for is that societies can change very, very rapidly when the time is right. For example, something many of you will remember, none of us thought, none of the politicians I knew, none of the political scientists and so on, thought that the Soviet Union was going to disappear and the wall was going to come down and so on. But it did amazingly. There's a great book called 1989, I think is the title, which describes how it happened in various places, but somehow simultaneously. So when the time is ripe, societies can change in a direction I think most of us would agree is a very good direction. And I think the job for all the rest of us is to find ways to ripen the time. Thank you very much.